What's up, everybody? Welcome to Frank Analysis. I'm here with you with Robert Inlakesh, journalist, contributor to The Last American Vagabond, RT, and Press TV, also a filmmaker, documentary. Highly recommend his documentaries on Palestine, which you can find on his YouTube channel, named after himself, Robert Inlakesh. It's great to have you back on, sir. It's been a while. I know that there's been a lot of chaos right now following the ban of RT from the European Union, which you covered, and also now RT America has been shut down. So, what is your take on all this?
Thanks for having me on again, by the way. A small correction. I've actually left Press TV now, so I'm not
Oh,
with Press
okay.
TV anymore. But it's it's crazy, to be honest. I mean, these countries which say they're for freedom of speech, that they have, strong charters of rights, and that they care about the law, and protecting journalism as well, are banning the opposition's point of view. And it doesn't matter what you think about that. Even if you're somebody that is, for instance, searching for information on what the Russian side is saying. If you believe that RT is just full out Russian propaganda, then why are you not able to access it, to see it? If it's so ridiculous, then why are you not able to see it? Why are journalists from the other side not able to see it, to quote it at least, maybe, if they need to make their own point? But what we're seeing overall, it's not just RT. Because a journalist like myself, I've been contributing to RT. I've never had a full-time contract with them, but I've been contributing to RT. I've never said a word about Europe. I've never said a word about Russia, even, really. I've never focused on them because that's not my area of expertise. That's not where I am, situated in terms of my thoughts. And I don't understand the issues as an expert. So I stay away from that. I focus on the Middle East and Northern Africa. And that's where my expertise is. That's where I focus on. That's where I know the most, and I have all the sources. So all of that information that I put out now, which includes, for instance, interviewing victims of bombing campaigns in Gaza, or people who've lost their children because they've been shot dead or affected by Israeli soldiers. These are some examples. People who are victims of torture. For instance, interviews with leaders of groups like Hamas, for instance, inside of the Gaza Strip, or interviews with the likes of the UN ambassador to Polisario Front, talking about and introducing the idea of what's happening in Western Sahara and how this fits into the picture when it comes to the conflict ongoing between Morocco and Algeria. All these opinions, all the journalism that I've done, and it's not just me. I'm just using myself as an example here. All of these people and journalists who have been covering events all over the world are now banned. You can't hear their positions. You can't hear their opinions. You can't hear these dissenting voices, which are overwhelmingly all critical of the West, especially because we normally come from the West. We're very critical of Western government policy. So that's what they're banning. They're not just
Mm-hmm.
banning Russia's stance or journalists in RT who are covering what's happening in Ukraine right now. They're banning everything. They're making sure you don't have access to it. I'm in the United Kingdom now. I can't see my own videos that I've released on RT. I can't see my own articles, which are published, which are in-depth articles, which I've spent a lot of time on, which I've interviewed people and found sources to reveal information that nobody else had and broke stories on that website. And you can't see it anymore if you're in the European Union or in the United Kingdom. And it looks like Canada as well. And the United States is on its way to banning it online. And I believe RT
Oh
America,
yeah.
of course, is shut down. I don't know if it's still on the airwaves there. But it's not just even RT, it's other agencies as well. Press TV was attacked. Why was Press TV attacked? Because the United States at that point was going after Iran. The neoconservatives in the United States, they don't like, their main focus is to go after Iran and to go after China. Russia, of course, is something that a state that they don't like, but it seems that the liberal imperialists are more focused on Russia. So they're going hardcore at Russia now. And it's not just state media as well. We're talking about now, I've just mentioned Press TV and RT, right? It's not just state media, so you can't hear the opinions of the Russian state media or the Iranian state media. It's independent networks as well, independent voices and journalists who are banned. Who, for instance, I'll give you an example: Mint Press. for example, in Google, to find their articles is very difficult. You're not just going to stroll upon their articles very easily because they've killed it in the Google search. That's what they do. They suppress these voices. It's about suppressing dissent, suppressing information. And it's just completely anti-democratic, completely anti-free speech. And now when they're trying to point at Russia or they're trying to point at China, I lived in China. I know what it's like to have a VPN to access certain websites, right? This is something they used against China for a long time. Oh, in China, it's so repressive. You had to use a VPN to get around, the complications of getting on Western websites. Now it's the other way around. I had to buy a VPN to access RT. So when we're talking about banning information, we're banning the opposition point of view, and it doesn't matter what your stance is on it. RT personally have never censored me. They've published information or my take on things, because I write opinion pieces and I write things that are completely, my opinion's not in it, for as much as I can keep my opinion out of it. But certain opinions that I've had, I'm sure RT editors disagreed with it, and I've been, questioned. Oh, is this right? Is this correct? But as soon as I can back it up, it's published, even if it goes against the line. I've never been censored on RT. I've never had my work. I've never been dictated what to say, what to do, ever. And that's something you can't say about these mainstream networks, because I have many friends that work for mainstream networks and they see how the censorship works there. So this whole banning of alternative media is an attack on freedom of speech. It's an attack on your ability to acquire the opposite points of view. And for people making this caricature of RT as if it's some horrible, just media outlet that's just constantly just pro-Russia propaganda 24/7, and it's lie, 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 lie. Point out their lies then. But
Yeah.
if you disagree with them and you can debunk them, point out their lies. Point out what they're saying, which you disagree with. Don't ban them. That's lunacy, and that's not supporting free speech. And lots of journalists, like myself and many others, like for instance Lee Camp and Chris Hedges, had shows on RT. Who else is going to employ these people and give them shows? It's ridiculous.
You would think that these people would be benefiting, like these Western mainstream outlets would be benefiting off of RT if they truly were lying, because it would be so easy to debunk their lies. But the opposite is true. It's independent media that has to debunk what Western mainstream media puts out. If you go on Wikipedia, when they give you their list of what they consider to be credible sources, they put Mint Press News, The Gray Zone, RT. They have them listed as controversial, things that you should be cautious of. And isn't this hypocritical? So their justification for why they're doing this with RT is because of what Russia did with Ukraine, which we can talk about the specifics of that in a little bit. But isn't this hypocritical when you think about what the US and its Western allies, the UK, Canada, have done to countries like Iraq, Afghanistan, how they're aiding Israel with the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, how they're aiding in the genocide of Yemen. Why isn't the US media, why doesn't that get banned? Why isn't the US banned from the World Cup or from FIFA gameplay? Right? So do you want to speak on that hypocrisy?
Well, it's a massive amount of hypocrisy, and this is what I've been focusing on lately. Like I told you, my expertise is not in Eastern Europe. I don't have an
Yeah.
expertise in Russia either. So for me, I focus on things where I can add something and add to what's going on. And to a certain extent, I can here when it comes to the media coverage, because most of the wars of aggression happen to be in the Middle East. Not all of them, of course, because it's not limited to the Middle East. It happens in Africa, it happens in South America, and all over the world, their aggression. But if you look at what they did in Iraq, for instance, in Iraq, 1 million people were killed. That's the most widely accepted estimate, is that 1 million people were killed as a result of that war. Prior to that, the sanctions on Iraq killed 500,000 children, we hear. Some other people argue and say that it was 300 or 200,000. It doesn't matter. Hundreds of thousands of children were starved to death. And the war that was waged against Iraq was completely illegal. There was no legal precedent for it. The United Nations didn't allow for that to happen. They just entered and executed a leader. And as well, you have millions of people that had to flee that country. They've completely destroyed it today. They're still in the country as well. That's another thing. And Western people, because of the media apparatus and what it teaches them to think, right? Western people completely overlook a million dead people and then can trust the same government which is responsible. The United States government is responsible, and Western governments are responsible for what's not just what happened in Iraq, what continues to happen in Iraq, because they still have control in Iraq to a great degree, which a lot of people don't talk about. And they still launch airstrikes as and when they like in Iraq, but nobody cares about it. Nobody wants to talk about it. And this is why we've seen video after video after video emerge of Western correspondents who get up there and anchors, news anchors, who say things like oh, it's happening now in a so-called civilized country. It's happening in the free world, we hear. It's happening to a country that's in Europe. Oh, so we need to care now. But why are we actually being told to care? Because it's an official Western enemy that's doing it, and it's not us. When we bomb people, when we kill people in their millions, nobody should care. But when an official enemy does it, when they attack anyone or do anything we don't like, then suddenly we should care. If you look at the wars that were waged in Iraq, in Afghanistan, the destruction of Syria, the war in Libya, the war ongoing right now in Yemen. Excuse me, a little bit sick. If you look at these wars, and like I said, Yemen is ongoing right now. Number one humanitarian catastrophe in the world. The United Nations estimate that roughly around 400,000 people have died as a result of this. It is US and UK bombs which are being dropped on these people in Yemen. And we are coordinating, and we are also launching our own airstrikes, Western countries inside of Yemen, to kill Yemenis. And we just should not pay attention to this, apparently. We have a huge, complete double standard. And it's okay when the Western mainstream media come up with their conspiracy theories. It's okay when they put out disinformation. It's okay when they blatantly lie. It's okay when they put out racist propaganda and double standards, and they whip up our rage and put us into a frenzy in Western countries and make us hate a people we know nothing about in a country where we can't even point to them on a map. And that's completely fine. We can hate anyone, kill anyone, but when someone else is doing something we don't like, then we point the finger. First, if you're living in a Western country especially, you should be pointing out your own government and pressuring your own government to bring this situation right now to a solution. Because you are not, your hands are not clean. We'd like to pretend they are, but your hands are not clean.
When I go out here, I'm here in the U.S. in the D.C., Maryland, Virginia area. When I go out and I ask a random person about if they know about Ukraine, they heard the news already. But if I ask them about Yemen, they most likely have never even heard of the country. They have no idea what's going on with Afghanistan, and that's because of how much of an influence, unfortunately, the mainstream media still has in manipulating the people. You were speaking about double standards here. Then here we see The Economist in 2001, after Bush invaded Afghanistan, they write a heart-rending but necessary war. But then here, 21 years later, in 2022, after Putin invaded Ukraine, they put this. And then I see it in coverages like on MSNBC and CNN and even in British news networks where they say, oh, this is not happening in Iraq. This is not Afghanistan. This is Ukraine. As if saying, like, it's so unbelievable that this is happening in a country with people with blonde hair and blue eyes. So what are your thoughts on this?
It's stunning. I mean, this is not even like, this is just, the tip of the iceberg
Yeah.
here. They're bringing on people like Condoleezza Rice onto Fox News. She just appeared on Fox News where she was condemning the invasion. It's literally, the host on there said to her, oh, it's just basic that if you illegally invade a country, that is a war crime. And she agrees with it. The irony of this is a woman
Right.
who was part of the Bush administration that invaded Iraq, and she's admitting that she committed a war crime basically by doing this. But then the fact that Fox News can actually put this out and can broadcast it shows that they believe truly that most Western people will watch that. Most people will watch that television show and will not see anything wrong with it. That's the horrific nature of what we're seeing here, and everyone's whipped up into a frenzy. Okay, if you care so much for this, okay, name five different cities in Ukraine. If you can't off the top of your head, you probably know nothing about the country. If you can't talk to me about anything to do with its history, or its government, or its policies, then you probably know nothing about it. If you can't point to it on a map, you probably know nothing about it. So you should at least try and educate yourself on the situation. And also, as well, look with a critical eye and a critical take on what your own government's doing. But this is the thing, the Western media, and another great example of this, I saw the Telegraph post a piece, and this they put it all over their social media as well. The Telegraph, which claims that it's objective and non-biased, glorifying Ukrainians throwing Molotov cocktails at Russian tanks. Now they even said the do-it-your-own, literally the DIY grenade, which has been destroying Russian tanks for decades. Okay, like just the most ridiculous statement anyway. I've seen many Molotov cocktails thrown at military vehicles. I've never seen one destroyed, by the way. So there's a side note. That's just something that should be noted. No, they don't destroy tanks. Molotov cocktail. I've never seen that anyway. I'd like to be proven wrong on it. Um, but they're glorifying it. And then if you look in occupied Palestine, when a Palestinian throws a Molotov cocktail at a military vehicle, they're terrorists, they're thugs, they're criminals. Why are they taking the violent route? Why are they doing this to an illegal occupation? Why are they doing this to an invading force? Why don't they just call for peace? And even if they call for peace, they're shot dead in their hundreds, like with the Great Return March, 330 people in Gaza, non-violently demonstrating, were shot dead, tens of thousands injured, non-violent demonstrations, quoting international law, UN resolutions, and calling for the end of the siege and their right to return, UN Resolution 194, holding up those banners, and they were shot in what the BBC described as clashes, and as what media like Fox News described as Hamas-backed riots from the Palestinians. A friend of mine, I'll give you an example. A friend of mine, his son, 17 years of age, was taken. He's still in prison, by the way, in administrative detention now for 10 months, which means he hasn't been charged with anything for 10 months. He's now 18. He turned 18 in prison. He was taken when he was a minor, when he was 17 years old. He was put for 2 months in a detention center called El Mosquibia Detention Center. This is for the accusation laid against him. There's a number of them, stone throwing, and one of them is throwing a Molotov cocktail. Okay, this is why this specifically touched a nerve for me. He was placed in a detention center in which he was hospitalized 3 separate times, a minor. He was put in stress positions, naked, and made to defecate over himself, okay, because they wouldn't allow him to go to the bathroom, and was abused for months in solitary confinement. His brother, who I spoke to, who is also in solitary confinement as well, he's a little bit older, he spoke to me about his torture. And by the way, I published this story talking about this actually on RT, on their website. I wrote about this. You can't see that if you're in Europe or if you're in the United Kingdom anymore. That story is going to be like on an archive page or something. Maybe you can see it, but it's never going to pop up for anyone. If you share the link, it's going to be presented as Russian propaganda. That story there, you'll never hear Western media glorify my friend's sons for something that actually there's no proof that they did. But just the accusation of it alone. And if Western media ever cover these stories, it's always painting the Palestinians as criminals. Why that double standard there? Well, we know why there's a double standard there. It's because international law matters when it's the enemies of NATO and the enemies of the United States. But international law, no one could give a shit about international law if NATO member states are to attack someone else and violate it. Because the law is, there's a double standard with international law. And when people start quoting, well, under international law, this, and this, well, you don't, if you're the US government and you're quoting international law, you have no legitimacy on that because you don't respect it. You don't even respect the ICC, the United States, for instance, the ICC's probe into war crimes, Israeli war crimes. And if there's ever a probe into US war crimes, you're against it. Why is that? Because international law doesn't matter to the West. So if you have a system where basically the superpower doesn't respect international law, how do you expect other states to respect international law? If we were living in a world where everyone respected law and agreements, we wouldn't have these sort of conflicts. But we have these conflicts because people don't respect them. And when the superpower is the biggest violator of international law, this is what you have. And when you have a media apparatus which is behind it for 100% and never dissents, rarely dissents, then this is what you have. The populations in the West want to go to war with you in Ukraine with Russia. Insanity, World War III, over something they don't even understand. This is and they present it as being anti-war as well. They claim that they're anti-war. You're not anti-war if you're backing one side in a war. You're not anti-war. That's not called being anti-war. Anti-war is saying you want to end it. I'm not going to give weapons and fight the other side. That's not being called anti-war. That's not what they're advocating for on mainstream press. That's not what they're advocating in Western governments. What they're doing is they want to bog the Russians down and create a Syria-style war inside of Ukraine and have it like an Afghanistan situation when the Soviets went into Afghanistan. That's what they want. They don't want to stop the war, clearly. Well, their rhetoric suggests that they don't. So that's not anti-war, even their double standards. So it's ridiculous. Like in both cases, they suck because they're not actually for the Ukrainian people. They don't give a damn about the Ukrainian people. Western mainstream media and countries don't care about Ukrainian people. Ukrainian people should be protected. They should be safe. They should have justice. But that's not what they're advocating for because the West doesn't care about Ukrainians. It clearly doesn't. They don't even care about their own people. The United States can't even feed the homeless in its own country. The United States can't eradicate poverty and homelessness in its own country. Can't give clean water to people in Flint, Michigan. So the priorities clearly aren't there.
And that homelessness is steadily increasing more and more and more, especially during the lockdowns. We saw that number increase. You can go down to the Capitol and you see some tents just outside the White House, outside of all these monuments. In LA, we have tent cities. All over the country, we see tent cities, just like you were mentioning. And they're also slowly poisoning us, giving poor people food with contaminants in them and pesticides and herbicides with known carcinogens, only to make them be in debt when they get sick and be reliant on these big corporations which also work with these other corporations, weapons manufacturing companies that profit off of war. And then we're seeing all this book burning now. People have to go through obstacles in order to find out what's going on. And the US isn't telling them, giving the full picture, what their involvement is. They just say Russia invaded Ukraine. But you did explain what exactly this means. So what does it mean that Russia invaded Ukraine?
Well, it can mean a number of different things. Of course, to begin with, when we're looking at this invasion, you need context. And this is the funny thing, when you provide any context to what's happening here, instantly you're going to be called a Putin puppet or someone that's being paid by the Kremlin and doing Russian propaganda and all the rest of that. I've said strictly since the start of this, I'm always anti-war, and I don't like the fact that there's an invasion. I don't like that. I don't like war. I don't like people dying. But I'm not stupid. I'm not somebody that just buys mainstream war propaganda, and that's what it is, hook, line, and sinker, without trying to understand the situation. And so I refer to experts and people that understand what's going on. I think the likes of John Mersheimer did a great service to everyone. In, I believe, 2015, he delivered a speech which covered the origins of the crisis which occurred in 2014 with the coup, which overtook the government, the Maidan coup, which overtook the Ukrainian government. And basically, if we're going to look at how this emerged, you cannot just pretend that NATO had no role in this. Just to single out Russia and just say that only Russia is responsible, which is what Western media does, which is what um, Western governments do, because of course they're never going to admit their own wrongdoings. You have to go back to when the country was under the rule of a president who was signing a deal with Russia, which the West didn't like. And of course, the population in Ukraine, as well as one which is very diverse and mixed in its opinion. There's many Russian speakers, native Russians, ethnic Russians. There, it's a very divided country between East and West, and many people, of course, want in Ukraine want to be part of NATO, want to be part of the European Union, but many people want to be close to Russia as well, equally, which you will never get told if you're watching mainstream news. And when this coup, which was backed by the West, by the way, so we can't pretend that the coup that occurred in Ukraine was somehow just fully organic. It wasn't. It was backed by the West. It was helped on by the West. And the West as well was basically, you can argue indirectly, supplying neo-Nazi groups because they knew that the most hardline groups are the ones who get the job done. And continue to do this as well, by the way. And these are the ones that they're going to use. So the West expanding, and we don't have the maps up here. The West wanted to expand NATO. Obviously, it's not likely that the Ukraine would actually go into NATO anytime soon. By the way, because you have to have full agreement by NATO states. So the likelihood of them actually being included into NATO, I can't say with any certainty that they wouldn't be, but I don't know if they were going to be. But definitely, what was happening in the Donbass, the 14,000 people who were killed in the Donbass over roughly 7-8 year period, and the conflicts, which as a result of these divisions within Ukrainian society, which erupted and was funded and was backed and was basically boiled up, made to come to a boiling point, caused what we see today. And Russia wanted to go in. Why? To protect its own interests, of course. But that's natural when you have NATO attempting to expand as well its influence and overthrowing a government which is, of course, on the side, which before was on the side of Russia or heading towards Russia in its sphere of influence. Russia's not going to like that. Russia made the move to take Crimea after, of course, there was a referendum there, but it made the move to take Crimea. And all of these things happened. But that was because of Western meddling in the first place, because Russia has a red line. Like it or not, that's what happened. And people say that this is about resources and about Russia trying to invade to take the resources of Ukraine, which is, in my opinion, a ridiculous argument because what can it do with those resources? It already has the resources itself. It makes no sense for it to be going in there for resources. Ultimately, anyway, with what I've just said is a jumble, a bunch of different things that I've just said there, and I suppose we could go into any one of them if you wanted to at any point. But you asked the question, what does this mean?
Yeah.
This could mean a few things. It could result in Russia's complete victory here, where they are able to either neutralize Ukraine, which probably would be the best outcome here, that Ukraine would remain completely neutral, or it will be able to establish a government which, get behind a government which would be more favorable to it, right? And take out the offensive weaponry completely and achieve all of their aims, whatever, and get done what they want to done. Alternatively, and this is what I believe the West would like, and according to some reports we've seen on the ground, and I can't verify them, this is what's beginning to happen. The command structures of these militia groups are now forming, and gangs are coming together. Ideally for the West, in my opinion, they want to bog Russia down inside of Ukraine. And that's when it really, really gets ugly. If people think it's ugly right now, it's going to get extremely ugly then. Because if you have militant groups, basically the army collapses, let's say, completely, and there's no Ukrainian army at all, that structure is gone. And we've heard reports that Zelensky has fled the country, but I can't confirm that. That's some reports that we've heard that Zelensky's already fled the country. Have no idea whether that's true or not, by the way. And there's so much disinformation coming out now. But if that happens and the Ukrainian state basically crumbles and the military crumbles, then what you will have is you will have factions and militias, which will basically be used and backed by the West with their weapons and with their, full economic and also really diplomatic backing, to fight the Russian forces and create an Afghanistan, when the Soviets entered Afghanistan type situation, or maybe for people who are more familiar with it, a Syria style situation. I believe that's what the West may go for at this point. If negotiations do not solve this, and this is not a limited thing, this could also go in the direction of what happened with Georgia when Russia entered Georgia, right? Obviously, Luhansk and Donetsk are declared now as their own people's republics. Perhaps they will be used there sort of almost as a buffer, as they're recognized by Russia, but not really anyone else. As you see, uh, the separate states or entities or whatever you want to describe them as that are in Georgia, that could come out of this situation. This could go many different ways. This is what I'm saying. And ultimately, you're seeing that in the Middle East, as a result of this, and this is something that I've written about and tried to focus on. And stop me if I'm going too far, and I'm going to a bunch of different points because I'm sure I'm rambling at this point.
No, you're good,
um,
man. We need to hear all these points and bring it all together.
Yeah, because this, by the way, this is just observing this and looking at this in the world of geopolitics. It's not me saying, oh, this and this, and like, I'm not taking a side here. Even I'm just explaining the situation to you. Russia is working for its interests. NATO is evidently working for its interests, and NATO have the role in really initiating this. And Russia is, it may have made a mistake or it may be doing the right thing from its perspective. I have no idea what it thinks and how it is trying to achieve this goal that it wants. I can't say whether they've done the thing from their point of view or perspective, which is right in this circumstance, and they've preempted something which is greater, or whether they've been drawn into a conflict in which they will get bogged down and it will cost them greatly economically and militarily. I don't know at this point. But if we look at how this has affected, for instance, the Middle East, now countries like the United Arab Emirates, which abstained from the United Nations General Assembly vote to condemn Russia's actions, is being placed in between this tug of war of Washington and Moscow now, and it doesn't know where to go. Israel is exactly the same. Now, Israel has, of course, voted in favor of the UN resolution condemning Moscow, but in its early statements, when Russia officially first announced its military operation and went into Ukraine, um, Israel were making very vague statements about, the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of Ukraine, but didn't mention Moscow. Because they too are freaking out about what to do. This is also in the Middle East. If we're going to Northern Africa now, is really going to test the resolve of the relationship between Algeria and Moscow as well, because Algiers has maintained a very, let's say, a very good relationship with the Russians, but at the same time, it's now being presented with these proposals. Maybe you can supply gas as an alternative to Russia, which no one nation can do that. And this is a very messy situation because of oil and gas now, and the sanctions which have came on. Okay. But also then, and this is something that's ongoing right now, and it looks like we're coming to the end of it, the conclusion of it, and that's the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA. Now, many people thought that the JCPOA was completely dead and it couldn't be revived, and especially the mainstream Western press, who, they were condemning Ibrahim Raisi. Raisi is the newest president of Iran, and they say he's a hardliner, he's horrible, he's the worst thing, he's Hitler, because everyone we don't like is Hitler. Without any comparison to Hitler, they don't actually they don't actually think like Hitler at all. But hey, everyone we don't like is Hitler. So everyone thought, even in the West, from their perspective, that this would never come back together and Biden would never do it. But I think now, because of the Europeans and this conflict which is waged on, and the fact that it seems like the liberal imperialists who are attached to the Democratic Party, and it's their ideology which rules the Democratic Party, they care about NATO, they care about the European Union to some extent. And so as a gift to them, I think it puts Iran in a better negotiating position to get the JCPOA revived. And I think that may mean that we see that the Iran nuclear deal, maybe in the next few days or weeks, will come back because of the fact that the Europeans want to trade with Iran. The Europeans just don't have the balls to turn down the United States and to go against the United States, basically. If the United States applies sanctions on Iran and says you can't do business with Iran, then they will fall in line every single time. So when it comes to the Iran nuclear deal, I truly believe that there's a very big possibility now that the Iran nuclear deal may be announced as a deal that has been revived within maybe the next few days or weeks. That's a prediction of mine. At least, at the very least, Iran has been put in a much better position to negotiate getting back into this, which is a positive thing. Because this will mean that there's huge economic relief for Iranian people now. They're going to feel it, and things are going to get better for the Iranians if American sanctions aren't, crushing them and their economy like it is currently happening. There are a few of the examples of things which are going on in the Middle East. Also, which I've noted, Israel, if it takes too much of a hard stance and aligns itself too much with NATO and the West, then what you might see is that Russia is going to take a slightly different approach to Israel, a slightly different and more harsh approach to Israel. And that could be extremely dangerous, given that Russia and Iran are both great allies with Syria, which is on the border of Israel. So this situation is really testing many relationships around the world between states. And specifically in the Middle East as well. This has had, I believe, a great impact. And of course, we could get into oil and gas arrangements, even with Saudi Arabia. But Saudi Arabia is now, its hand is strengthened because it's being asked by the United States to basically pump up more crude oil to lower the prices. And Saudi is sitting there saying we need more support for our war in Yemen, and the recognition, according to Reuters reports, and the recognition of Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince of Saudi Arabia, as the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia, if we're going to do this for you. So it has had a great global impact. And this is being called the new Cold War. And that's because it's having such a global impact, because of these partnerships which have been formed between the West and between the likes of Russia and China as well. And it's really having a massive impact around the world. So yeah, I've covered a few different things. I went on a whole bunch of different topics there. So it's a bit rambled and jumbled up. Yeah, correct.
All of that gives more perspective now on why the US is so focused on this issue now, why nonstop they keep talking about this. Same thing with its allies in the West, like the UK, is because it's going to be a huge global power shift. It's going to influence all these different countries and how those resources are going to be used and distributed. Now, I want to touch on a point that you brought up earlier about making Ukraine sort of this neutral state or this buffer region. It's my understanding that the decision to make Ukraine a part of NATO was back in like 2008, I think. And Russia they want to take back Ukraine. How do you think, what steps need to be taken in order for the US, NATO, and Russia to come to an agreement to leave Ukraine alone and let this be this buffer region?
Well, NATO had stated, it put out a joint statement, which basically concluded that they wanted to include both Ukraine and Georgia as part of NATO. And the conflict in Georgia, which ensued, was in large part to do with this as well. I don't believe either of them will become part of NATO. I don't think that's going to happen because honestly, if that happens, then it's direct conflict and confrontation between Russia, which is a nuclear power, and NATO, which obviously is the United States, which heads it, and that's ultimate destruction. And I don't believe, as crazy as these policymakers are, I don't believe that anyone wants nuclear war. I don't believe that they want to get into that. I believe at this point, if Russia basically crushes the ability, and it may be, I cannot say because I don't have sources on the ground and I don't actually know what exactly is going on the ground, but I would guess that Russia has been trying to take out positions where possible militant groups would assume control, take out possible leadership, the possible leaderships of these groups, going after people that are perhaps forming their own groups, and stopping them from forming these groups before it happens. Because if that happens, and basically we have guerrilla warfare against the Russians, then this is going to be extremely difficult to get out of, and this is going to go on for a very long time. But in order to make peace happen, there needs to be an agreement. Basically, both sides are going to make concessions, I believe. If a peace agreement comes, both sides will have to make some concessions. Um, and but I think Russia doesn't want the offensive weaponry there. That will be an absolute. It would like the Donbass to be left alone. And I think that the Western powers had to accept that it's not going to become part of NATO, and I think they
Hmm.
know that, but it's the fact that they wanted ongoing tension, and they didn't care about ripping apart Ukraine in the process. They could have said, we're never going to place, it's never going to become part of NATO, right? It's a strong ally, but it's never going to become part of NATO. We're not going to try and include it in NATO or the EU and try and bring it into our sphere of influence. And they could have preempted this. And at least then, if Russia invaded then, after you've said, no, not NATO, no, not the EU, then what justification whatsoever do they have? So there has to be compromise made by both sides. And when I say both sides, the Ukrainian government's not the only one compromising here. The West has to agree too, because the West is the one which really holds the cards in terms of the Ukrainian side right now. The West is the one providing it with the power. It's providing it with the weapons. So, and it's the one that has basically set it up in this situation to fight the Russians. So there has to be compromise made. And I believe on both sides, there definitely has to be some compromise made, or the Russians will just keep going until they get what they want. And if it does turn into a Syria style situation, it's going to be very ugly. I don't have all the answers in this
Yeah.
situation. And I must say, and I keep stressing this, I'm not an expert on Ukraine. So
Yeah.
I'm not the number one policymaker here, but I'm somebody that just understands geopolitics and have looked at it from somebody that studies it and understands what's going on and all of the factors that are here, rather than somebody that is a specific expert here. So I'm not somebody that's going to be at the negotiating tables or wants to advise anyone here. But if the conflict's going to stop, then there has to be neutrality there. That is the principle. That's what everyone that I've listened to and who I refer to as sources on this issue, and experts on this issue, would argue that the way to create peace is a certain amount of neutrality there. But again, big business interests, the interests of multiple different powers here, are all combined when it comes to this country. There's a lot of history here, and it's not a simple one to solve. But it could be very simple, and it could have been simple, and there could have been a lot more done to stop this before it even occurred. But in my opinion, that there hasn't been strides towards that. Instead, we see Western media and Western countries behaving in an authoritarian manner to crack down
Yes.
on even the Russian opinion. Well, if you can't even accept their opinion, then how are you even going to negotiate with them if you don't understand their opinion and why they think like they do? Western leaders understand it. The Western people should also understand it too, because nobody here, and I'm sure you are the same way as me, I don't want war here. I think it's horrific. I think this whole thing sucks. It like, my feelings go out to everyone that is being hurt right now, because I really don't want this to happen. I see there's absolutely no benefit in this having happened, and this should have been stopped a long time earlier. But I'm not somebody that's going to sit here and say that, oh yes, Russia bad, Russia bad, Russia bad. Russia had its reasons. Russia clearly went in for a reason, and to ignore those reasons and to ignore NATO's role here is just stupidity. Or it could be fueled by blatant nationalism. And that's what we're seeing. They don't want you to juggle multiple points at once. They don't want you to turn to what's happening actually in Ukraine on the ground. And they don't want you to know what your government's done, because they can't admit any wrongdoing on their own part. And this whole scenario, by the way, I might add, this whole situation, this war, has exposed Western media for all of its double standards. It's racism, It's double standards when it comes to war, the law. It's outright advocacy for resistance now. They care about resistance, apparently. They care about resisting occupation, and they care about resisting an invading force. Uh, of course, they don't. So I think it's really shown how where everyone is. A lot of the public as well, how wrong they are in their analysis on this. And honestly, it's just been warmongering and hatred, and this is translated to hatred for Russian people, and xenophobia, which I've seen rampant hatred of Russian people. Russian
Oh
people are
yeah,
not the
yeah,
government, by the way. You can, if you really believe that Putin is Hitler, and he doesn't even roughly resemble Hitler, but um, if you believe Putin is Hitler, right? Even if you believe that, okay, what do the Russian people have to do with that? Why are you going after
exactly.
them? And the rhetoric they are using, and the likes of Hillary Clinton, who went out and said that Russian people have to be punished by the sanctions. Russian people have to be punished in order to bring this to a close. So she's advocating basically collective punishment. Punish one people to save another people. Why are we advocating these things? Why are we banning people, for instance, musicians in the United States, for not condemning Putin? Why are we putting people in prison, apparently, in two NATO states now for siding with Russia because of their political opinion? Why are we banning media which gives the Russian point of view? Why are we doing that?
It's
Because we're
like
pro-war.
it's like if you and I were punished for the war crimes that our countries have committed. We had nothing to do with that. We didn't vote for that, right?
Exactly.
But now they want to even punish them. Like I saw even Marvel Studios saying they didn't want to distribute their movies to Russia. Russia is now being banned from the World Cup, as if the players have any fault in this, as if the fans of the sport of football have anything to do with this. Absolutely ridiculous.
We're treating Russia like it's apartheid South Africa at the end of apartheid, because before that they supported apartheid, the West, by the way, and only when it was absolutely untenable for that apartheid regime to exist anymore, then suddenly we isolated them, and we were able to. The Western governments got on board, and the media got on board in
This,
isolating them, but and they supported it for most of apartheid, by the way. It's only when it became untenable. But we're
yeah.
treating Russia like apartheid South Africa, and Russian people have no part in this, other than people who are in the military, I guess. But the Russian people, what even if they're uh, pro war, they're pro Putin, they're pro everything. Why should they be punished? What are they doing?
Yeah,
I'm
what if
sorry,
they're
you
just
can't be
victims
punished.
of even if Putin was a bad was a this like the night like Hitler 2.0 like they're portraying him, what fault do the people have for being manipulated by their media? You know, it's the brainwashing. Like who the person who should be punished are the people that control the brainwashing. But yeah, you're right about how they're treating it like apartheid South Africa. It's the reaction that people should be having towards Israel, an apartheid state. Um, but
Because we're
there's
doing this
that
since
hypocrisy right
1948.
there, right? In international law, if it were truly respected, Israel will not be a state.
Exactly, and for somebody who's actually seen war up close, by the way, or a war situation up close, and has family members who have directly suffered, and for my wife, family members who died as well in conflict. I'm somebody that actually knows something about war. I've been shot at, I've been gassed, I've been chased down by soldiers, and abused by soldiers, and I've seen people and children shot in front of me, and I've seen all these horrible things. So to call me pro-war is ridiculous here, and I know what war brings and what it means. I do, and I don't want this for anyone. But we need to understand all of the context behind this and why it's happening. And we also need to understand that you don't just demonize an entire people because of something like this. You don't. But this is what the West does, and I keep noting this. The West always does this when it goes to war, because the West is all about collective punishment, shock and awe. So we have to go after, not just, if we're going to go after a Muslim nation, we need to demonize Muslims. If we're going to go after an Arab nation, we need to demonize Arabs. If we're going to go after Iran, we need to demonize Iranians. That's what we do. That's our speciality. That, for instance, and we've been doing it for a long time, look at the horrid racist propaganda against the Vietnamese. Look at what happened to the Japanese placed in concentration camps in the United States, right? Because of the racist propaganda. And this has continued to happen. And the hate crimes occur because of it, because people get whipped up into a frenzy of this ridiculous nationalistic feeling that they are against this enemy, which they're now being placed against, which are ordinary people of a country which they don't understand anything about. So they look different to us, they think different to us, they have a different political ideology, and we need to basically exterminate them or get them out of here or ban them and punish them for what? Being who they are? They're different, and that's fine. People can be different. We don't, but that is what the West does. We demonize entire people. But like you said, Israel, which has been doing this since 1948, since its very inception, and of course, as well, those Zionist militias expelling 850,000 Palestinians from their land, their homeland, which has caused all of this today as well. And they, of course, continue this ethnic cleansing slowly today. They have never been punished. There's never been the sanctions placed against Israel. Who is sanctioning Israel for its actions? No, in fact, we're not sanctioning Israel. We're calling the other side terrorists. We are allowing for their punishment and their crimes against humanity, their international war crimes, what Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and Israel's top human rights organization, B'Tselem, called apartheid to occur right now. And we're funding it with billions and billions of dollars, with new weapons technology so they can continue it. We're aligning ourselves and we're banning all of the opposition voices. See, this is a situation where I can really relate this to Palestine with what's happening with Russia, and two separate situations, not comparing Russia and the Palestinian resistance, not at all, but the same approach from the West, right? Of we don't negotiate with, we don't listen to, we isolate, is applied to the Russians. Any enemy, the same thing. We say that we can't talk to Hamas, the biggest Palestinian political party. We can't talk to them. We can't engage with them. They're terrorists. They're horrible. They're Hitler. They're blah, 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 blah. They're this, they're that. And we need to kill them and expel them and whatever, okay? That same stance is being applied again with Russia. And they'll do the same thing with China. They'll do the same thing with any state which dissents, Cuba, Venezuela, whoever. We don't listen to them. We don't listen to terrorists. We don't listen to this. We don't listen to that. And if you don't listen to them, then how can you resolve the conflict? If you can't understand their point of view, even if you disagree with it, even if you vehemently disagree with it and you're on the opposing side of the ideological spectrum from them, right? You need to listen to them if you want to resolve conflict. So listen to them, sit down with them, speak to them, understand their ideology. And the public should be also understanding this too. So the public can get behind a peaceful resolution. The public can get behind peace talks. Right. The public can understand the issue, but they're never taught this because the leadership in the West understand this. They understand this, and they act in the way they do for a very specific reason, because they want the continuation of conflict. And it's horrid. And that's why we're in this situation.
Oh, it's always important to get at the root of why people are believing what they believe in, why they think that going to a certain war that they believe is holy, that will justify, their reasoning for why they have this hatred over certain groups, etc. It's important to get at the root of it. Where did this originate from? Why do they have this hatred? Why do they think grabbing this piece of land is going to achieve that? But yeah, we do see the mainstream media demonizing groups of people. I've also been seeing the tokenization of certain leaders. Like, for example, they tokenize Zelensky's Jewishness to try to discredit any criticisms of his involvement in working with the Azov battalion and the other Nazis in that region. So I wanted to get your thoughts on this before you head out here as a final question. What do you think? What do you say to people who bring up Zelensky's Jewishness as a reason to support Ukraine? I mean, we see the mainstream media using this as a PR device. They use this as a shield against, again, these allegations of Nazism in Ukraine. And I just want to pull up this article. It just came out by Max Blumenthal and Alex Rubinstein on the Gray Zone. PBS News noted Putin's comments on denazification with a qualifier. Even though President Volodymyr Zelensky is Jewish and his great uncles died in the Holocaust, On Fox and Friends, former CIA officer Dan Hoffman declared that it's the height of hypocrisy to call the Ukrainian nation to denazify their president is Jewish after all. On MSNBC, Virginia Democratic Senator Mark Warner said Putin's terminology, outrageous and obnoxious as it is, denazify where you've got frankly a Jewish president in Mr. Zelensky. This guy, Putin, is on his own kind of personal jihad to restore greater Russia. And then there's more examples here. But yeah, I wanted to get your thoughts on that. The tokenization of Zelensky's Jewishness to discredit these realities of Nazism in Ukraine.
Well, it's ridiculous to argue just because of somebody's ethnicity that this or that is the case. I mean, who cares? Who cares what he is? Honestly, I mean, it's great for him that he's Jewish. That's wonderful. Great for him personally in his life.
Yeah.
That's it. I don't care what he is. He could be anything. He could be Muslim like me, and it wouldn't make a difference, in my opinion. If a Muslim leader was in charge of Ukraine right now, does that mean the Azov battalion doesn't exist? Does that mean there is not Nazi elements there? Of course there are. There are neo-Nazi elements. So not everyone in Ukraine or everyone fighting or everyone supporting Ukraine is supporting Nazis or that it's all Nazis. That's not true.
Right.
That's blatantly not. It's not all Nazis. No, that's ridiculous. And people saying that it's all Nazis are of course just It's like a stereotyping. It's lazy, but.
Right.
And that's not the case that they're all Nazis, but has the West backed the Nazis there, the neo-Nazis there? Yes. There are people with neo-Nazi sympathies? Yes. And it's the only army that I know of which actually has open Nazis with a Nazi battalion, neo-Nazi battalion in its army. So that's a real factor. You can't discard that. You can't say, oh, this time we ignore the fact that there's neo-Nazi. You can't ignore the fact that there's neo-Nazis just because the leader is Jewish. You can't say that. That's just ridiculous. It's stupid. But see, they'll do that because when they'll pull out, again, double standards with racism and ethnicity and identity politics. When it's comfortable for them to use it and it's a good time for them to use someone's ethnicity, they'll do it. Like, for instance, I'll give you an example. In the United States, right? They use Kamala Harris. They put her in charge of border policy because they think that looks better to have a woman of color managing horrid policies when they're deporting Haitians and when they're putting children in cages. Because if a white guy's doing it, it's bad aesthetics. It doesn't look good, right? It looks worse. So they're going to use someone's ethnicity to do that. If a bad policy is there, if neo-Nazis are there, they're there. That's it. As a Muslim, for instance, seeing videos shared by the National Guard, I believe it was, of the Ukrainian military, attached to the Ukrainian military, put out a video of the Azov battalion literally dipping their bullets in pig fat so they could shoot at Chechens who are Muslim, because they believe in their racist ideology that if they shoot a Muslim with a bullet that has pig fat on it, that we as Muslims won't go to heaven if we die with pig fat. This is the most ridiculous, racist, horrible, whatever you want to call it, if you don't want to call it racism, because it's not race. Islam, of course, is a religion. Bigotry. Then, yeah, like it's that. I see that. Yeah, you're pulling that up here. I can't ignore that. I'm sorry. And I don't support that. How can I support that? And if Russia wants that gone, then you have to concede that's a point. However, if you have a problem with, let's say you think he's painting of Russia over the whole nation, and he's saying everyone's a Nazi, then disagree with that point. But to deny there's Nazis, neo-Nazis, sorry, not Nazis. Obviously, the Nazis were defeated a long time ago, right? But, and thank God. But when it comes to neo-Nazi, you can't deny they're there. And also, as well, there's a lot of neo-Nazi groups throughout Europe as well, which align themselves with the Israelis. And people don't like to talk about that. Far right-wing groups in Europe who are attacking Arabs and Muslims and immigrants and are anti-refugee, if they're black and brown skinned, by the way, only. They're fine with white refugees. They're attacking them, and they're aligned with Israel. They're pro-Israel, at least. And that's their position. So to say that, like, these two things can't exist in one government, of course they can. It's ridiculous to say that they can't exist. They do exist, clearly, and that's happening. Why that is, I don't know. Does Zelensky have a problem with that? I don't know. Perhaps he has a huge problem with it. Perhaps he can't do anything about it.
Right.
I don't know. I have no clue. But it exists. I'm not going to deny it exists because it does. And like his Jewish identity is great for him, and that's it. That doesn't mean you can use it. Why are you using his identity for this reason? It's ridiculous to me. Look at
Right.
what's actually happening. That's what
It,
what they do, not what they say.
it's like saying that the drone strikes on black and brown people in other countries weren't happening because we had a black president with Obama. And a great
Yeah,
point that you brought
right.
up about Kamala Harris also, and what's going on with the border, and think the comments that she's made.
Well, it's funny because we've changed in the way that we look at things, and in some ways, it's good that we're more sensitive to racism. But this situation here has really revealed a lot of that to be bullshit, quite frankly,
Yeah,
for a lot of people, and just virtue signaling. But it's good that we're more sensitive to racism now. That is a good thing that's come out of this.
it's
But
true.
back during the Bush administration, for instance, they would never use that card because look, Condoleezza Rice was part of the Bush administration. Colin Powell was there. Were they using the arguments back then that because they were black people in the government that somehow it wasn't racist what they were doing, the coverage of Iraq, it wasn't lies, it wasn't going into a country and killing people and demonizing them as a people, the racism was impossible back then? No, because back then nobody really cared about that so much, and there wasn't much sensitivity as well to issues of racism. But now we're more sensitive to this, okay, which is a good thing in many ways. But they weaponize that. That's the problem. They have now weaponized that way and line of thinking, and they've made everything into identity politics. And I'd refer to Edward Said uh, on identity politics because it's attributed identity politics to him as him being the founding father of it. But in fact, he said that he despises the politics of identity. He doesn't think it's useful. He says identity is very much important to the individual and very much important, but it's not what you want to mix in with politics. And I'm paraphrasing him. So again, with all of these issues, refer to experts on it, and you have to look at this critically and not just eat the state line, hook, line, and sinker. And that's what people do. They did this with Iraq and they hated Iraqis. People were openly endorsing the bombardment of Iraq and finding it fine. And now, as well, look at the double standards and the racism. That people can just brush aside the fact that the war on terror, the estimates are that 6 million people have been killed in the war on terror as a result of it. 1 million because of direct military confrontation, like bombs dropping on people and killing 1 million people. So, directly because of that. If you can overlook 6 million deaths, and many might argue that it's a lot more than that because of other reasons and not counting people, okay? If you can overlook that, then you really have to look at whether you're anti-war and you're anti-racism. And also, if countries that are responsible for that over the past 20 years, if they're responsible for that, are they in a moral high ground? They have a position from which they can punish other countries, or they have the right to meddle in other countries' affairs or argue using international law that someone else should be punished? First, put Bush in jail. First, put Blair in jail. Then the West can argue, after it puts all its own war criminals in jail, that it respects law and it can use the law. I don't see it having a good moral platform, a killer accusing someone else of killing.
Right.
It's like that's the thing. The double standards have to be called out here. You have to understand that. And if you're going to be consistent and anti-war in every sense, you have to really look at it from all sides and all perspectives and how this works and how the world works, how geopolitics work, not how I look at a piece of propaganda and some guy's painted with a Hitler mustache and now I believe everything. Now I'm full for this side, because if you're cheering on uh, fighting on one side, then you're actually pro-war, aren't you?
Right.
In this sense.
Yeah. Yeah. Robert Inlakesh, I could ask you questions for hours and hours. Thank you very much, man, for bringing your knowledge. A lot of lessons here learned about history. I appreciate you coming on. Is there anything you want to plug in before we head out?
All the outlets I write for, I guess, all my social media outlets are there. I'm thankful to everybody that does give me a platform because people like myself are being censored every other day. So, and we're being censored more and more. And I believe that voices that are critical have to be, given a voice. But ultimately, as well, like the others who have just lost their jobs, for instance, at
Yeah.
RT, that themselves have been robbed of platforms, not just at RT, but other outlets as well. People need to turn to them. And also, as well, if you don't agree with me here and my framing of everything and what I believe, then that's fine. But I shouldn't be censored, and neither should anyone else
Right.
with similar opinions. And refer to the experts on this. Go and see what they have to say, what they've been writing about on this conflict. Don't just buy the propaganda hook, line, and sinker like people have been doing. It's dangerous.
Right. Thanks again, Robert, and everybody else. You're not alone, and I know you'll stay informed. Take care.
Thank you, brother.